For those of you who don't know me, my name is Darcy Overland, and I am the research manager at the Center for the Study of Cooperatives. And I'd like to thank everyone for being here in the room, and first off, of course, acknowledge that the land on which we gather is Treaty 6 territory, the traditional territory of Cree peoples, and we are on the homeland of the Métis Nation. So we are here today for our annual MacPherson talk. This talk has been put on by the Center for 3 years. This is the third one. And it's been put in place to honor the late Dr. Ian MacPherson, who was one of the leading lights of the international cooperative movement. He was a historian, educator, author, and passionate cooperator, and Ian personified the relationship between Canadian cooperative academics and co-op practitioners. This is actually the 5th anniversary of Ian's passing this year, so we're very pleased to be able to host a speech annually in his honor that features an international cooperative scholar or practitioner whose work reflects the values that Ian held so dearly. This year we'd like to add, of course, as always, we acknowledge our sponsors for our center, which allows us to continue to plan and host seminar events and undertake study and work with our partners in the sector. But this year we'd also like to put a special thank you to Cooperatives First and Dr. Ken Coates, who gave additional financial contributions to ensure that we were able to live stream today's lecture. So we will have the Executive Director of Cooperatives First, Audrey Kruger, come forward to introduce our speaker this year. Thank you.
Thank you, Darcy. I'm just going to speak a little bit about Cooperatives First, and then I'll introduce our guest speaker today. Cooperatives First is a business development organization. We work in Western Canada with rural and Indigenous people, and we also have a focus on cooperatives. And so we do two things. Well, we do more than two, but we have two big buckets of activities. One is around the education promotion of the cooperative model, and then if people are ready to take the plunge, we work alongside the groups to help make their dreams a reality. And so for those of you that don't know the origin story of Cooperatives First, it begins in this building here. A number of years ago, there was a group of Federated Cooperative Limited board members and senior executives that were talking about the state of affairs in Western Canada around co-op knowledge and co-op development. Where were people at in terms of their knowledge? Do they understand the model? Is it relevant today? And what would be needed to have another sort of push of co-op development across Western Canada? So they worked with Johnson Shoyama and the Center for the Study of Cooperatives on a research project called SIP. So this 2-year research project was very ambitious, and lots of people in the room here participated in that and contributed to that. But what the research project came out and said was that the knowledge level was quite low across Western Canada, and particularly in Indigenous communities. And what was needed was a organization that was dedicated to working on the education and working alongside communities to help them develop co-ops in Western Canada. So in 2016, in March, we were created with funding from Federated Cooperative Limited, and we're quite thankful for that, and here we are today. It is my honor to introduce today's speaker, Nathan Schneider, an author that's so warm and open that I feel like I know you already. I enjoyed your most recent book, titled Everything for Everyone, The Radical Tradition That is Shaping the Next Economy. His book is a personal exploration of cooperation in its many forms through history, geography, and technology. Cooperatives First hopes to assist communities with their own versions of these radical traditions. We support the formation of co-ops like the Food Forest and Learning Center, where Maggie Blue Waters works with families to provide a safe space so they can heal in a way that's culturally relevant and meaningful. Maggie and your group could have chosen many other models, but they felt that the cooperative was a good fit for their ideology, for their ethics, for their worldview, and they, most importantly, made it into the perfect fit. So it was something that they felt that they could adapt, and we were really excited to help them do that. In Smoky Lake, we assisted perhaps the only co-op daycare in Alberta, the Pumpkin Patch. And this inspiring group of pragmatic community members were not going to wait around for someone to solve their own problem. They were the experts, they knew what to do, and they knew that the co-op model, after working with us, could be the good fit for them. So I can go on and on, but basically what I'm saying, Nathan, is we have a Western Canadian chapter for your next book. There's lots of cool stuff going on here, and so we're excited to have you and host you. Nathan Schneider is an assistant professor of media studies at the University of Colorado Boulder and a journalist who writes about economy, technology, and religion. His most recent book, Everything for Everyone, The Radical Tradition That is Shaping the Next Economy, is published by Nation Books. His two previous books, God in Proof, the story of a search from the ancients to the internet, and Thank You Anarchy, Notes from the Occupy Apocalypse, are both published by University of California Press. His articles have appeared in Vice, Chronicle of Higher Education, The New Republic, Harper's Magazine, The Nation, America, Religion Dispatches, and other outlets. He has lectured at universities including Harvard, Columbia, MIT, Yale, and now the University of Saskatchewan. You're welcome, Nathan. You can put that in your bio now. I'm going to look for it. In 2015, he co-organized Platform Cooperativism, a pioneering conference on democratic online platforms at the New School, and co-edited Ours to Hack and Own, The Rise of Platform Cooperativism, a new vision for the future of work and a fair internet. So please help me welcome our speaker, Nathan Schneider.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for having me here. It means a great deal what I've seen already about the way in which this center is bringing together the cooperative legacy that we have to build on and the anchor cooperatives in the community, as well as developing new ones and paving a way forward. To me, out of the work that book required, that need has felt the most urgent. The need to connect generations, to connect the tradition with opportunity. And so I'll be talking today about some of the opportunities, some of those opportunities that are arising around the world. You may know this person. I think she's been here. This is Brianna Wetlaufer. She's fierce. By her early 20s, she was an executive at iStock, large stock photo platform where people can, photographers post their work and publications companies, whatever, buy it and use it in their reports or their content, whatever it is. Big business, right? And she's sitting in the boardroom and along with her colleagues realizes something is wrong, right? They've got this successful platform. They've sold it to an even bigger company. Yet they're constantly pushing down, pressing down on the very people who are creating value in the company, the photographers. And that doesn't make any sense. She's a photographer. She knows what it takes to do good creative work. This isn't the way to do it. And realizes that if you're going to do stock photo right, if you're going to get the best people, pay them fairly, and make sure that you have a sustainable and flourishing model, you can't just be serving the investor owners at all costs. And so without necessarily spending time at places like this, being saturated in the co-op model, the cooperative was the choice that she and her colleagues made. They left iStock and formed a new company called Stocksy United, choosing the cooperative model because it allowed them to be accountable differently when they're making those hard decisions in the boardroom. It's a company owned and governed by its photographers, its employees, and there's a founder class as well. It flipped the story, it flipped the decision-making process, and produced a successful company that is able to take a good chunk of the top end of that market. Now, another example, this is close to home for me. In Denver, Colorado, around the same time, 2013, 2014, 2015, a group of taxi drivers, like taxi drivers around the world, are feeling the pressure of the new platforms, the Ubers and the Lyfts. They're kind of between a rock and a hard place, between these platforms that are gaining growing market share but are not paying living wages, and companies that are under pressure and are consequently pushing down even further on the drivers. So around 800 drivers banded together and self-finance the development of their own taxi cooperative with their own app as a means of surviving in the context of an increasingly difficult market, of pushing the 1%, in a sense, out of the business so that they could survive in it. And still today, they are one of the largest taxi companies in Colorado. Now, each of these is an example of a broader phenomenon, a shift that online technology makes possible toward an economy of platforms, an economy that is built most of all on generating value from connection. So rather than the kind of pipeline model of a company that produces something, distributes it, sells it, a platform is a business in which connection is where value is produced. Connection between buyers and sellers, between people sharing resources, and you end up with companies that are capturing larger market share in their industries than any company we've ever seen on this planet in many cases. And at the same time that are running with numbers of direct employees that are orders of magnitude smaller than similarly sized companies of previous generations. Now, this economy of connection, might be something familiar to those of us in the who know about the cooperative tradition, right? Cooperatives have often thrived in this through doing precisely that, creating value out of connections. But this model tends to be powered by a very different kind of structure, generally by a venture capital financing model that pays for its high-risk investments by demanding unending and rapacious growth of the companies that they finance, driving toward monopolistic practices and abuses, and driving out competitors at all costs, disrupting communities rather than empowering them. And there's a mismatch that is becoming visible in more and more places. We see this in labor protests among people who are ambiguously classified, who are working for one company day in and day out, yet are classified as independent contractors. And then increasingly, the questions of accountability around personal data that these companies are capturing. We hear people talking about data as the new oil, the oil that is powering artificial intelligence and advertising and a whole swath of new economies. And yet it's kind of unclear who is in control of that data, who is its management accountable to. And especially since in the United States, since the 2016 election, those questions have become very front of mind for many, many people, where we see the abuses and the dangers that that control over data and information can manifest. And in the months following that election, Mark Zuckerberg, the founder and essentially monarch of Facebook, because of the degree of power that his special share class accrues to him, wrote a long essay kind of wrestling with what had just happened, called Building Global Community. And in it, he seems to suggest that he sees Facebook and platforms like it as creating a new kind of social contract, a new kind of global citizenship, and feels a sense of responsibility in how that citizenship operates, how that community operates. It's it's a little heartwarming to see that he means so well. And yet, we see him asking, as if for the first time in history, questions that actually have been dealt with in the cooperative movement for generations. How do you build a company that is in some sense accountable to the people it claims to serve? How do you develop governance that is relevant both globally and locally? Again, he seems to be coming to these questions fresh, as if there is no such tradition to build on. At the same time, in these years, as this online economy has become increasingly important, there have been a set of entrepreneurs who have recognized that there is something to build on, who've recognized that in this cooperative tradition, they could build a real sharing economy in which the sharing goes all the way down, where it's not just a superficial interaction or language masking a kind of transactional experience, but is actually part of the ownership structure of the company itself. And actually, when you match the rhetoric of a lot of what we see coming out of the most high-minded conversations about what we hope technology might be able to deliver us, we find ourselves hearing resonances of what this cooperative tradition has aspired to, again, for generations. So in 2015, I started working with a colleague at the New School in New York City, Trevor Schultz. For some time by then, I'd been working as a reporter and had been starting to notice some of these projects where people were building this real sharing economy. And at the same time, Trevor had been working with people in the context of the gig economy and these new online marketplaces, and also came to this idea that this cooperative tradition represented something essential and essentially needed in this online economy. He coined the term platform cooperativism, and we started working together to turn the term into a kind of movement. We announced in the middle of 2015 that we would be holding a conference on the subject in New York City, and were blown away by the response. Within a few weeks, we had over 1,000 people registered, and it was clear that there was a tremendous appetite for what was going on. People were pouring in from all sorts of directions, wanting to get involved. Out of that conference came a book with some of the leading thinkers articulating their rationales and the experiments that were already underway. And we developed a directory as well at ioo.coop, Internet of Ownership, that attempts to make visual, make accessible the growth and the development of this kind of quiet community. And one thing that was striking to me too is how so many of the people doing this were doing it alone. They didn't see each other, and they also didn't see so much the cooperative legacy that they had to build on. They didn't know how to contact anybody who'd actually built a large cooperative business before. In many cases, they might not have known that such things really exist. Maybe they were like me, and the only cooperative they'd been a member of was a housing cooperative, and that I was part of in college with 12 people packed into a dirty house, right? Having 2-hour excruciating meetings every Sunday night. And so that frame was kind of the totality of the reference for what is so much bigger and broader. I'm going to take you on a little tour of some of the projects that are in this directory and that give you a sense of how this model may be poised to kind of invert the digital economy in really critical ways. Now, we've really started this work focused on questions of labor, questions of how people are receiving value, are seeing the returns on the value that they're creating. This is a fundamental question of our time, where as productivity increases, the income share of that value is decreasing. Up and Go, for instance, was a platform just getting started as we were having these early conversations in New York City. It's a platform that works with and is actually owned by a set of home cleaning worker cooperatives in Brooklyn that enables them to access the platform economy, that enables them to access customers through an app that's just as easy, as the apps that they find disrupting their industry and lowering the standards of their work. Core staffing is a new one. This is still very much in development, focused on it's a kind of staffing agency that focuses on working with people previously incarcerated, working on building trust and capacity for them to enter the workforce on their own terms. Now, another kind of model has been in development in Europe, especially out of artist communities. SMART stands for Société Mutuelle des Artistes. It's a Belgian, initially, organization, now cooperative, formed among artists just to deal with the bookkeeping needs that artists have as they're going from gig to gig, job to job, right? And it turns out, actually, that the needs of precarious artists about 15 years ago are increasingly the needs of a growing workforce today. So this platform developed for artists, enabling them to access, social benefits, accounting tools, representation in interactions with clients, is now no longer just needed by this peripheral workforce, but is increasingly being integrated into the gig economy. And SMART is now spreading across Europe with tens of thousands of members in more and more countries. Now, another interesting development is that in the last couple of years, we've seen some of the biggest, baddest platform companies starting to recognize the importance of ownership and starting to turn to opportunities to share ownership with their workers as a means of building a more sustainable, more aligned business structure. And I think the opportunities they're seeking right now are inadequate, yet they do point to the possibility. What if the big platform companies were competing with each other, were bending over backwards to better share their value with the people contributing that value? What if we had the tools to ensure that that sharing ownership and governance were as easy as sharing a ride? And then we look to the question of artificial intelligence. What does it mean when we're contributing data and the data of our lives to the development of the forms of intelligence that increasingly seem to be shaping the next economy? How do we make sure that we have a stake in that means of production? Now, some of the attempts to answer this question around data and the intelligence that it produces have been forming in this community of platform co-ops. MeData, for instance, is a health data cooperative in Switzerland developed by medical researchers who were looking for a data pool that they could use in their research, but one that would be in accord with regulations and that would streamline the relationship between patients and researchers. And they found that making the patients the owners of that data store was a way to do that. And because of the market that these founders represented, they've been able to build this company on the revenue that they're generating through the research projects. Now, another twist on this kind of model, this is based in New York, is Savvy Cooperative. It's a patient insight platform owned by the patients themselves, where companies that are looking, for instance, to do a study on a new medical device can go to this platform, find patients willing to provide their insights, but again, the patients set the terms of that interaction. So it breaks this system that often isolates and alienates patients from the research and development process, and instead helps them gain a stronger voice in that process. And this is founded by a veteran patient advocate, by people who are themselves living with chronic conditions, and so know this situation very well. We see a new generation of development in agriculture where cooperatives have traditionally been strong, where farmers start realizing, hey, something's happening with all that data that our new tractors are putting out. Who's going to be in control of that? Startups are praying for this stuff. Venture capitalists are praying for that data right now. What would it look like to ensure that the next generation of farmer technologies are also under the control of the farmers themselves, where producers continue to be in charge of their access to market and the technology they need to do their business in a competitive market. Now, again, connection is so critical to this kind of economy, and how we set up those connections is again, a question of how we own and how we govern. So a few years ago, you might remember there were rumors circulating that Twitter might be sold to Google or Salesforce or Disney. Even all these crazy ideas were being thrown out. And I have a great affection for Twitter. I kind of fell in love with it while I was a reporter during the Arab Spring, and I was the kind of reporter who didn't have enough money to fly to Cairo on a dime. So I relied heavily on what I could learn from this platform, and ever since, it's been an essential part of my work and life. And so the idea that the reminder really that this platform is really a commodity that could be bought and sold was kind of shocking to me. So I wrote an article in the Guardian suggesting, hey, maybe we should at least consider that Twitter might be sold to its users in some form or other. Can we just have that conversation in addition to talking about it maybe getting bought by Mickey Mouse? And that idea got a bunch of people excited, people who'd been organizing through this global network. And we developed a campaign to spread this idea and to develop it. We ended up getting a shareholder proposal in the Twitter annual meeting itself. Got a pretty good, nearly 5% vote, which enables us to resubmit in the future, which we're very much looking forward to. But it also helped us just kind of raise this banner and get people talking about this possibility. It also led to the development of a new platform using existing technology. This is a platform called Mastodon, which, unlike Twitter, is what's called a federated social network. Usually I have to explain what federated means, but since I'm in a room of cooperators, hey, this is something that co-ops have been doing all along, right? Building larger networks out of smaller ones, retaining the local autonomy while achieving economies of scale. So this is a network that enables us to have a Twitter-like community instance that is connected with other similar instances using the same technology, all through open protocols. That way we get to set the rules of our platform and drive out Nazis. And we can still participate in a broader network. So social.coop is a cooperatively owned community providing this social media tool. We self-govern on a tool called Lumio and run our money through a tool called Open Collective. Everything is online, virtual. Many of us have never met in person. Now, a critical question in this digital economy is around intellectual property. Who owns the code underlying these technologies? And a lot of what powers the internet is open technologies, open source tools that have been built by communities, but often they've been the basis of incredible extraction. So for instance, the phone in my pocket is built on the Android operating system, which is derived from Linux, which is an open source operating system developed by an open community of software developers. But it also has been used by Google to create the most sophisticated piece of corporate surveillance the world has ever seen. You know, what if we were able to hack intellectual property to do things a little differently? For instance, one proposal for how to do this is the peer production license, which hacks some of these open source licenses a little bit to say, okay, you can share the code, but you can only monetize it if you are structured in some sense as a cooperative. So it's a way that protects that open sharing, but also constrains the forms of the economies that can be built on top. And as part of this effort, we've been in the process of developing what's called the Platform Co-op Development Kit. This is actually thanks to a $1 million grant from Google that Trevor Schultz is administering to develop tools to build a kind of bedrock, kind of backbone of software that'll make it easier to develop platform co-ops, all open source and free, and being developed in collaboration with cooperatives, especially in the Global South, that can use these tools in extending their work. So he's working with co-ops in India and South Africa and elsewhere. Of course, cooperatives need their own kind of finance. You know, for a lot of people, the assumption is you can't finance cooperatives, but in a room like this, we know that when cooperatives have succeeded and thrived, it's because they've developed their own systems of appropriate financing. And that's something that we sorely need in order to build this new generation of platform co-ops and more. This has been echoed outside of the cooperative world, for instance, by groups like Zebras Unite, which is a really amazing group of startup founders who are largely women and people of color, not the usual face of the startup world, who recognize that in order for us to succeed, we can't just rely on the structures that are built for communities that are not like us and that are just trying to extract rather than meet the community needs that are our priority. And so the Zebras Network has been working to convene and organize people interested in financing and developing new kinds of startups, including but not limited to cooperatives. But it does just demonstrate how more and more people, even in the heart of the startup world, are recognizing the need for creative financing, for forms of financing that are appropriate to community-oriented businesses. And as they do, they're actually kind of replicating stuff that cooperatives have been doing for a long time. For instance, this is an early chart from a group called Purpose Capital, founded by a young Swiss serial entrepreneur who'd sold some companies over the years, and German, and he realized, hey, this is stupid. Why am I just building these companies just, again, to sell them as commodities? What if we created an ecosystem where we could build companies designed to be stewarded? So he's developed this concept of steward ownership and developed a financing model to support it, where companies actually finance each other, have investment in each other, and grow together. They share their profits among one another, and then don't need to be, and actually can't be, sold as commodities. So we see companies that are not, necessarily co-ops, but have some mission-centric focus and see this as a very appealing strategy. And more are starting to get on board on this model. It looks to me a whole lot, actually, like CoBank, the $128 billion cooperative bank down the road from me, developed out of the farm credit system in the early 20th century. And then we see some crazy experiments with cryptocurrency, blockchain-based Bitcoin-like mystery land, where magic money comes out of cryptography. One early experiment is called Faircoin or Fair Co-op, an attempt to create a cooperative financial system on the basis of a Bitcoin-like currency, required really redesigning the structure of the underlying software to put cooperation at its core. And then a more recent example, RChain, which is using a new kind of math to solve some of the technical problems of other blockchain systems, and actually chose to organize its developer community as a cooperative. And now they're forming cooperatives in different regions of the world to support that community. And in each case, they're kind of struggling with governance. They're reinventing a wheel. They're relearning lessons that the cooperative tradition has had to learn in the past in other contexts. And then this is an effort I've been involved in called Start.coop. It's the first equity accelerator for cooperative businesses specifically, itself formed as a co-op, right? So we're taking the model that has powered the development of so many successful tech startups, of creating intensive programs focused on high-risk ventures that provides a lot of umbrella support around, basic business processes and access to mentors and access to financing. And we're putting that in a cooperative context. We're really designing this to be accessible to large cooperatives as investors, and already several have come on board to do just that, so that cooperatives can participate in helping to develop this new generation with a kind of risk balancing and can see a return for their members in doing. So governance. I mean, again, in so many contexts, you find people whose main context for cooperatives is maybe having lived in a house of 12 people who are making decisions about which kind of quinoa to buy, right, on Sunday night. And that isn't scaling to these kinds of platforms. But we also have some other legacies to build on. For instance, I mentioned Linux. One of the core versions of the Linux operating system has been is called Debian, and it's been governed for many years now on the basis of a really interesting constitutional structure where you have elected positions and so forth governing the project, governing thousands of developers working together all over the world. So this is an example of how the digital cultures have already kind of started experimenting with this kind of governance. And then we have tools like Lumio, developed by a New Zealand worker cooperative, which is constantly building tools that can help people co-govern without seeing each other in person. And we need much more of this. And there's actually a lot of experimentation going on around this, both in the cooperative community, but also outside of it. In the blockchain world, there's a lot of interest in governance. And so this is a real opportunity for a flowering in governance tools that can operate both for these new platforms, but I think can also help reinvigorate the governance of our legacy cooperatives and create new opportunities for interface and for voice. Education is, of course, a critical cooperative principle. This is the Cooperative University of Kenya, a place very dear to me. You know, coming from the United States, where we don't have so many centers on cooperatives, you can't get an MBA in cooperative business. It was astonishing to me to go visit a entire university just devoted to cooperative business. And actually, we should have had at least one of these. Leland Stanford, the founder of Stanford University, after his years as a robber baron, concluded that the only solution to the conflict between labor and capital was cooperativism. And so when he founded Stanford University, he inscribed in its founding documents and said in his first speech to the student body that the university should teach the rights and benefits of cooperation, advice that it is almost completely ignored. But this university, which is the core anchor of Silicon Valley, might have played that role, and we could have a different kind of story to tell. But we do see examples like in Spiral, the network that also produced Lumio, has its own coding academy, you know, these non-accredited camps where people come for a few months, learn to code, and get a job. And they kind of copied that model, but put it in the context of a cooperative. And so in their program, you learn how to code, but you also learn how to start to think like an owner and how to integrate that technology you're learning with cooperative principles and practice. Now, as in past generations, policy is absolutely critical, and it's been part of our conversation all along. This is our first conference in 2015. We had Maria del Carmen Arroyo, a city council member then from the Bronx, one of the poorest districts in New York City, who had already been supporting policies for worker cooperatives, and who embraced this platform cooperative idea as well. And we've been kind of blown away by the interest in policymakers who are stuck between, again, a rock and a hard place, between enabling these new innovative online platforms, but also trying to retain control over their basic transportation, hospitality, and other infrastructures that these platforms are privatizing and monopolizing, in plain view. They need alternatives and options, and it's so important to realize that alternatives are possible. For instance, Austin, Texas, a couple of years ago, took the courageous step of actually requiring Uber and Lyft drivers to get the same kind of fingerprinting that existing taxi regulations required. Shocking, right? And in response, Uber and Lyft left the city, said, we're not going to deal with this. And in the vacuum that they created, the city helped in the development of a new taxi cooperative, and a nonprofit ride-sharing app called Ride Austin, which charges the drivers just $1 per ride, flat rate, and allows riders to contribute to local nonprofits as they pay for their rides. Both are still operating, even though the state government overruled the city government and took away that regulation, and Uber and Lyft came back, really hurt the market share of these two projects. Nevertheless, you can use Ride Austin just the same as any other app. The drivers love it, and it just demonstrates how you don't need an $80 billion company to connect, a smartphone and a map and, a few buttons. The problem is not as hard as they make it out to be. Just like the problem of delivering power or fertilizer or financial services is not as hard as the big investor-owned firms would like us to think. We can build these in other ways, and when policymakers have stepped in to level the playing field, we've seen some really extraordinary examples of how alternatives are possible. And places like Barcelona, in some ways South Korea, and others have started adopting this. One of the major parties in Germany has just explicitly embraced platform cooperativism, as has Jeremy Corbyn, currently the leader of the British Labour Party. And so they have been turning to this model as a means of having a third way. And we're seeing increasing development in the US federal government as well. But, I want to be clear about all these things I've just said. This is really hard. And most of the time lately, since like that exciting, fun, packed 2015 conference, things have gone from like the excitement around the idea to founders saying, I'm not sure if we can keep this up. We've been trying, beating our heads against walls, and we can't find financing. All of the other startups around us are just, finding resources and accelerators and supporters, mentors, and we just don't have them. There aren't even enough of us. The culture doesn't even know we're here, right? And that's been what a lot of the last few months has been for me, is accompanying people in that process. Our cryptocurrency just deflated, and we're in big trouble. Real stuff. Real kind of weird stuff, but real stuff. So far, we haven't made a dent. There's a lot of experiments, but there's no market share. This is something that is familiar to many of us developing cooperatives in sectors that we would love to transform, but we're not in a position to do that right now. Certainly not in this digital economy. We need to really step up our efforts as those in previous generations have when they have built the ecosystems that their sectors required. So a first piece of this is, of course, spreading their story. Lots of us are trying to do that. But at a certain point, the story only goes so far. You can only call for Twitter to become a cooperative so many times before somebody says, prove that this is actually going to work and that this is a better way of doing things. And that's where we are right now. I've kind of felt like I've been writing the op-eds for enough years, banging my head on that wall. It's time to shift and make sure that there's some there. It's time to build infrastructure, policy support, and power, frankly, that is necessary to challenge the direction of an increasingly extractive, investor-driven online economy. I think this really needs to begin with cross-generational relationships and mentorships. We need to build trust. We need to create opportunities for young people developing these ambitious, risky types of models to find older people who know this model is real, who have real-world experience operating them at scale, and can provide the kind of guidance that these folks need. Often, when people complain about a lack of financing, what I hear is lack of relationship and lack of trust. When you look at the venture capital environment, one of the reasons why a lot of the people involved look like a lot of the other people involved is because that's what makes relationships easy. And relationships are really at the core of how, especially in risky environments, financing deals happen. When people trust each other enough to know that there's going to be accountability. And we need to make sure to prioritize building those relationships, creating mentor networks, creating structures of reward so that those mentors actually, those people with experience, see some benefit out of the system by providing that mentorship, even when the reward might not be there in the short term. And that, I think, can help lead to appropriate cooperative financing. Structures so that when people have a good idea that needs to get tried out, that needs some real runway, we have the capacity to do that. Our cooperatives, at least I know better in the United States, we have corporate venture capital arms, that are investing in conventional companies in conventional ways. We need to develop those kinds of models much more intentionally and much more integrated into our business planning to support the next generation of cooperatives. And with that comes policies. What are the wish lists? So many times what I tend to see is cooperatives defending what they have, and rightly so. It's under attack. But we need to have, I think, much more imagination about what the next generation of cooperative policies can look like. I think on the scale of the Rural Electrification Act of 1936, that within a decade brought cooperative electricity to 90% of the rural United States, including the farm that my grandfather grew up in. That is now a revenue positive program through a revolving loan fund in the Department of Agriculture. This is appropriate financing. This is not, a handout. This is leveling the playing field so that cooperative models have a chance to operate just like any other kind of business can. And with that kind of ambitious strategy, built on relationship, built on new financing strategies and policy, I think we can upend this narrative of disruption, where the job of technology is to destroy our social bonds and destroy the livelihoods that we depend on, and instead put empowerment at the center. Imagine if founders of startups could aim their companies for an exit to the people who care about them the most, right? I live in one of these weird little startup hub towns. And when you talk to founders, all they're aiming for, because it's what they're trained to do, is get that early investment, exceed expectations, sell what they just created to an even richer investor, right? Either through an IPO on a public market, or more likely in a buyout to a larger company. Again, create commodity, sell it. But I've heard from a lot of those founders, we wish we had other options. We wish we could sell to the people who love the thing that we created as much as we do. But they don't have that option right now. We don't have the tools, the legal, the financing tools to make that a real viable strategy, and one that can actually pay for the risk and investment that getting those companies off the ground take. But this is possible, and this should really be the aspiration. Where a company like Facebook, as it reaches a kind of maturity, can gradually express that maturity in its ownership structure and see it reflected in accountability. This is also a tool of regulation. We find, for instance, in our utility sector that strong regulations are less necessary with cooperative utilities than investor-owned ones, because there is some internal oversight that an investor-owned company doesn't have in the same way. And in the tech economy right now, we're seeing a patchwork of regulations happening. With Europe's privacy regulations, other countries, other regions considering their own sets of regulations for transnational companies. I think we need to build our regulation much more into the structure of the companies than pretending that these kind of geographic political structures are going to be adequate to address companies that can move their data centers, move their people, move their operations wherever is most convenient. And we can think about scale differently. The venture capital model drives toward conglomeration. It drives toward these kind of vanilla monopoly lands where everybody, no matter where you are, is on the same platform all the time. I actually think the cooperative internet could be a much more interesting internet, one that is able to include those economies of scale, but also able to include diversity within it. And that accountability that comes with cooperative ownership as well. Now, this stuff is really different from the world we're in right now. We're a long way from here. But when I'm faced with a founder who I've been encouraging for a while and is just running up against dead ends, when it really doesn't seem like it's going to work, I've actually had to turn to history. That's been my only source of confidence as this effort has gone on. I know that we have done this before. I know that powerful cooperative enterprise has shaped the nature of our economies, the structure of our economies, in ways people don't appreciate. And so I know that we can do that again in the ongoing shifts that we're involved in right now. We just need to remember what this model and models like it have achieved and raise our ambitions for what we need to achieve today. So, thank you.
I'm just going to do this from here, I think. It's a pretty friendly room. I think we can probably self-moderate some questions. We do have time for questions for Nathan. So I would just ask that you do come to this mic, because that way our live stream can appropriately get the audio on the questions as well as the supplied answers. So I'll open it if anyone would like to come up and...
Thank you for a wonderful presentation, not only for the reassurance and the accessing of an inspiriting and empowering history, but also for the po-faced, sober look at the extent and nature of the enemy, and the urgency of the operation of cooperation without co-optation and recommodification. It's an enormous challenge. If we're going to tell our story, I completely agree with you. If we're going to tell our story today, in the current conjuncture, two things seem to me to derive from that. A, that the singularity of that story is both inclusive internally and historically grounded and historically inflected. And it should also be productively intergenerational. But that also, the second thing is, how do you read the current conjuncture? How do you get out of your bed in the morning knowing what the news will be and knowing what the endless challenges to core values of cooperation are? And it seems to me, I would like your response to two things. It seems to me that the platforms, Zuckerberg and company, are now being constructed as not the techno-triumphalist version of democracy, but actually as enemies of democracy, platforms for the subversion of democracy. And that raises a question of how hard do decent, well-behaved cooperators, how hard do they go against that particular development in the name of the democratic advantage that the co-ops can plausibly appeal to, both in history and in current practice? That's one of the questions of this. The second question I'd like you to, or site of possibility I'd like you to respond to is, education is crucial. Cooperation without co-optation, education without commodification would be a couple of my favorite mantras. You have worked in the world of journalism. You're now working in the academy. They're often seen as analogous stewards or custodians of the public good through the belief in data and its effective analysis and circulation. So how do we go, how hard do we push the democratic advantage? And what is your experience of the compatibility or the incompatibility or the awful similarity between the world of media with its structures of ownership and the world of post-secondary education, which is supposed to be, of course, be autonomous, but is only too readily co-optable as well?
Whew. Thank you. Thank you. Lots to work with there. I'll try to thank you for raising all those points. I mean, one thing that is striking in the culture surrounding, tech startups is, a kind of common trajectory is to take stuff that is kind of a democratic structure or a commons and replace it with an economy. Okay, replace it with a market. Take something that, like taxi governance, right? Take a kind of broken democracy, or at least something regulated by a semi-accountable democracy, and replace it with an automated, supercharged financial market. You know, behind your Uber app, there's a bunch of like, basically an auction system that's running. And I think some of these companies are starting to realize, I'm certainly seeing this in the blockchain world, which is even more in this direction. People are starting to realize, oh, actually, you can't run everything just on markets. Like, I think most of us knew that already, but you know, markets are very appealing for engineers because, you know, they're more measurable. There's more stuff to measure. There are more levers to pull than the messiness of democracy. But I think we need to recognize that the answer to that a tool we need to turn to in the failures of these markets is democracy. And also that we can't just protect past democratic institutions from 200 years ago. To me, sometimes the most important thing is to remember and remind people that we need to be advancing democracy in order for it to survive. We need to show that democracy, as past generations have, is more efficient than other forms of resource distribution, you know, if we are attuning it to the needs of the moment. And that's why some of these new kind of governance strategies are really important. You know, we need to be continuing to advance. I think that's the only way we'll be able to compete with that kind of market centricity. Around the question of education, I think it's really, in some sense, kind of scary what we're up against. There are, you know, I did a story for the Chronicle of Higher Education a few years ago on the extent of cooperative education in the United States, which is, there are some great people doing great things, but it's approximately zero compared to the other stuff. And there was a kind of systematic, you know, dismantling of the system of cooperative education that was intentionally developed out of the populist, farmer-driven political organizing of the late 19th and early 20th century, right? Systematically disassembled. You know, you saw this again right after Trump's election. You know, the White House proposed a budget that completely eliminated all of the Department of Agriculture's cooperative development programs, right? Including those for education. And so we need to figure out new beachheads. It's difficult because business schools, however well-meaning the people involved in them are, they're dependent on a relationship with business that in turn centralizes wealth accumulation that allows for people to name business schools after themselves. The pools of money in the cooperative sector just aren't as big because they're returning profits to their participants. And so we need different kinds of strategies to ensure that we can compete. I've found that there's actually a growing openness in business schools. They've already been embracing triple bottom line language. You know, they just need to be reminded that that when they're talking about social enterprise, when they're talking about this kind of family of you know, do-goody types of business, that actually there's some, you know, hard, you know, legacies that they can build on, especially in this sector, that this isn't new. And I find when I, you know, work with people who are, you know, right now I just ran a conference on Wednesday in Colorado in partnership with our business school, you know, and you know, I was able to find people there who said, you know, I've been wanting to do something like this for years, just the opportunity never came up. So I think that there's, you know, the media question is another one we can get into, but it's that's been an area of great interest to me as well. Yeah.
Thank you for this very inspiring presentation. I cannot agree more with you about many ideas. I'm an associate professor here in Shaoyama. Recently, what I'm thinking as a public policy professor is some of the phenomena you already identified. There's a kind of a not a balanced power structure there. One is the corporate world, right? Another one is this distrust with the institutions and the government. So there's a general trend in the Western society, but we can continue like this. But the negative side, the downside is autonomy of individuals, of communities, local. So we cannot continue in this way for a longer time when artificial intelligence, big data came in, kind of fill that void, right? So what you identified, there is actually two ends. One, if there is no such a local organization of individuals, who can exercise their autonomy, their creativity, then sooner or later you will just be replaced by this online platform. It's another power actually, right? But the problem is, like what you identified, either it's too big to fail, like those global, like Facebook, right? So people have the trust, but it's too big. Another one is the local co-op or other organization is too small to survive. For startup, it's the same problem. So in between, there's nothing, kind of, today. So the problem is, like what you identified, is the diversity. Once you go a little bigger, there's diversity, there's heterogeneity, there's different interest, then things get messier. So how do we get away with this? What I mean is this is important because this is part of our flourishing individual, flourishing society in the future. We need such an intermediate organization or a way of organizing governance.
Well, I think the issues you raise around the group and the individual and autonomy are really interesting, because one way in which the legacy runs into limits is the legacy of the big co-ops of today were developed for a kind of industrial scale production in an industrial model with industrial culture, right? And the platform companies are operating with a different set of cultural assumptions. And they're operating with different assumptions about who the individual participants are, right? I mean, these are not companies designed for the model, that my grandparents were part of, where, you get a job and you work in that job full time and your needs are basically cared for if you manage to get that job, or you're in the social class that enables you to. It was cooperatives that enabled my family to access that model, that way of life, that industrial world. Today, a company like an Uber, right, has people who, often appreciate the fact that they're able to kind of check in and out whenever they want. They don't have a fixed job. Their relationship to work and labor is kind of different from that older model. And actually, cooperatives, I think, can, and should be helping to shape that shift. One thing that I struck me in research around these kind of emerging forms is, for instance, I was reporting on the Catalan Integral Cooperative in Barcelona, around Barcelona, very new model, very experimental, very focused on this kind of flexible economies. And I asked them, that famous Mondragon place is, not too far away from you. Are you inspired by them? And they just kind of looked at me funny, like, no, we don't want jobs. Like, we're trying to escape jobs. We're trying to create a different kind of social organization, right? And there's this kind of dream that I see occurring in a lot of places I look, of a kind of open company, open organization. In a way, Uber points to that, right? A job that you can kind of come into without applying for, really. Do your work when you feel like it, and then leave and do other things, right? And a lot of the new cooperatives, too, are aspiring for that kind of model. And it's come to be called, among some of the kind of people thinking about this, is open cooperativism. And so part of this whole process is not just replicating the industrial cooperatives in the tech economy. It's actually about recognizing that the nature of the cooperative structure will be shifting as well in this. and that the cooperative structure, as it has in the past, can help us actually shape the new social contracts that are being developed and have repercussions even outside of the cooperative model. And that requires kind of different kinds of scale of organizations. I hope that helps, but
since no one else is here, I'll take my turn at a question. I beat you, Marc-Andre. To me, one of the things about democracy is ensuring that there is place for not only the majority voices, but also minorities or people of lower socioeconomic status. How is that shaping out in platform cooperativism? Are we seeing it primarily utilized by those with greater power already in society, or is it an equalizing force?
Great question. These kinds of experiments are happening in a lot of different contexts, and I think that's good. I think it's there are some, I think, tendencies to say that these models need to just serve the most urgent populations. I think the biggest challenge is actually creating bridges across, creating new forms of solidarity. So for instance, that core staffing cooperative that I mentioned that's working with returning citizens, formerly incarcerated people, they've actually just recently pivoted, in my understanding, to continue doing that, but also focusing on doing staffing for highly skilled technologists of color, right? Who are able to access much higher paying jobs, but are also underrepresented in that industry. Through solidarity, this much more precarious community can get a leg up through the relationship with a more skilled, higher income community. I think building that kind of solidarity in these models is really important. One thing that a few of us have been talking about a lot is the extraordinary sociologist Juliet Schor did a really in-depth study in her ongoing, again, really extraordinary work on the gig economy on Stocksy United. And one thing she has been sharing from that work is that the income distribution in Stocksy is very unequal, largely because it's a producer cooperative, and a small number of the producers are doing most of the value creation, right? Are selling most of the stuff for one reason or another. And that's just raised a lot of questions. Is this a problem for us? Or is this okay? Are we okay with the terms of this inequality? Or is this something that we need to deal with? Those are questions that, I think don't have obvious answers, but which are kind of, at least we should be addressing them cooperatively. Finally, I would just say that these kinds of things require different development models. For instance, in the context of Start.coop, this equity accelerator, we're trying to take on hard social justice challenges, but we're also an equity accelerator that has to generate returns for the cooperatives investing in us and their members. So we need to build a little bit on the privilege of the people who are participating. And the hardest challenges might not be right for that model. In contrast, the Google grant has enabled us to develop software in partnership with some very, very precarious communities because it's on a basis of a grant. So I think it just means that we need to have different development strategies for different kinds of challenges and not assume that everything needs to look the same or that everybody needs to focus on the same kinds of challenges. But I hope that we'll be creating a diverse ecosystem that enable different kinds of businesses to get going. Yeah.
Great talk, Nathan. Thank you so much. So just last week, our federal government introduced a budget bill. It's called an omnibus bill. It has 800 pages. In those 800 pages, there's about 30 or 40 pages that amend the Bank Act. And among other things, it forces the banks to train their employees and take the interests of their customers into account when they sell them products. So I remember I was reading this and I'm like, well, they're basically making them behave a bit like a co-op might instinctively behave. And so I think there's always a risk, and there's a literature about this, there's a long tradition of governments forcing kind of more capitalist firms to behave more like cooperative firms, and then ultimately squeezing out the co-ops because everything starts looking the same. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on that, because I think you were talking about there's the commons and it gets exploited to make an economy, but from the other end, government also comes in and can shut that down too. And I think even these little daycare co-ops, so I helped start one in Ottawa, and then regulations started piling up and just made it almost impossible to run a co-op daycare. So I think there's real challenges there, and I'd just be interested in your views on that policy piece, because I also think back just from the credit union perspective, Bergengren filing, these guys, they fought really hard to get legislation, to get regulation that was conducive to the co-op space. And so I'm interested also in if you've seen anything in that space, people actually working at that institutional level to make it possible for these things to get off the ground and stay off the ground.
Yeah, well, it's a great issue to bring up. We just had a case in the U.S. where over the summer we passed a major financial, essentially, deregulation that was presented publicly as if it was mainly serving credit unions and community banks, but the numbers got changed toward the last minute that protected regional banks that approach a scale that and a structure that does not deserve that sort of protection. And so we saw, a kind of co-optation effort. The good news, I think, is that what we've been finding is quietly there is a kind of shocking consensus around willingness to support these kinds of businesses. Support, for instance, for expanding employee ownership is on both the 2016 Democratic and Republican platforms. The rationales are totally different, right? But the proposal is the same. And so when the Main Street Employee Ownership Act passed a couple months ago, as part of slipped into the Defense Appropriation Act, unfortunately, it received very strong bipartisan support, and we're seeing a few such proposals gaining that kind of traction. I think the question is one of power, and how well organized is this sector to protect its interests and to educate lawmakers. I've been just doing a study on the relationship between U.S. antitrust law and cooperatives, right? 1922 Capper-Volstead Act, farmer cooperatives organized to protect themselves against the antitrust laws that were being turned against unions and other forms of popular organization by large companies, right? And they were successful in that. I wish they had done it for co-ops other than just those of farmers. The freelancers could use that right now. It would be nice if their organizations weren't treated as anti-competitive. But it was a reflection of how the power was organized at that time. So today we need to push for the kind of regulation that's appropriate for our sectors. In credit unions, if we need a meaningful, shift in how finance is done, one way to do that is to work from the top down. One way to do that is to enable credit unions to scale more. Enable cooperative banks to provide a real counterweight. I'm very interested in what that kind of structure could be. Again, the experience of the past suggests that people have been very ambitious in creating the kinds of policy that has produced the businesses, the cooperative businesses that were able to thrive. And we need to do that now. Really, fortunately, I do think there is an appetite for this among policymakers. Big challenge is making sure that there's power behind them to support that. And then also the challenge, I think, too, is not letting it get caught up in the partisan nonsense, right? I mean, this is something that like people on many sides of our political maps can get behind for their different reasons. And the danger is that when, in our country, when a Democrat says something, it means all the Republicans have to disagree with it, right? So it's a catch-22. You want more awareness, you want this to be on the map, but you don't want it to be too loud in a way, because this, as you know, Bernie Sanders has been talking about employee ownership a lot lately. I think people are kind of like, no, be careful, because Paul Ryan, you know, has been a long-standing supporter of employee ownership, and we don't want to lose that. You know, it's a funny challenge in this moment where the lie, in a sense, is that everybody disagrees about everything, when in fact this is something that you know, people on all sides can actually get behind. The question is, how do we tell the story? How do we build that power in a way that doesn't just fall into that divide and conquer politics?
Thank you very much, Nathan. That was wonderful. I have a question about, you made a reference to the importance of intergenerational relationships. So my question is, what kind of recognition, knowledge, support are you getting from the NCBA and other established co-op federations like that?
In my experience, it's been a bit of a challenge in learning how to navigate these worlds that are built around long-standing organizations. To me, what I've found is that all of these organizations have people who really want to be allies to the new generation. And you just have to keep knocking on doors until you find those people. You know, fortunately, they're starting to come out of the woodwork. One example is the now president and CEO of NCBA, Doug O'Brien. Spoke at our last Platform Co-op conference, or the previous one. Actually, our last one was in this year in Hong Kong, but the previous one, New York, he spoke at, and has been, you know, in constant communication with people working to develop this work. Also, leaders in the NCBA, people like Howard Brodsky of CCA Global Partners was a sponsor of the last New York conference. I've been working with him to develop infrastructure in Colorado, and you know, been really vital. Jessica Gordon-Nembhard has been a real kind of connective line between the older guard and the new projects, especially working in low-income communities. And so there are those people who have kind of stepped up to play both sides. And that's challenging because the language is very different. And it requires real skill. Skill that, for instance, I'm just learning to, you know, just trying to develop. Like, how can what does each side need to know about one another? What do they need to hear in order to feel that they can trust the process? You know, it's not easy, but we need more such allies. One of the reasons why we're developing the Start.coop project is that we're trying to create it's not just about money. It's about creating a space that we can invite those leaders into, among other mentors, and provide them a kind of packaged opportunity for working with very promising projects. And so, you know, one way of describing Start.coop is an interface. And lots of our other projects are like that too. And it's no, you know, I hope he forgives me for saying this, but it's no accident that the person actually leading Start.coop is Howard Brodsky's son, who watched his father over the course of his childhood build, you know, go from being the owner of a small carpet store to a CEO of a national cooperative. That intergenerational experience is part of what, you know, that he has lived his entire life, is part of what is behind that the insight that we need more of this.
So we want to, the live stream is actually going to end very shortly. We do have the room for a bit longer if there's more questions and more conversation to be had. But on behalf of the Center for the Study of Cooperatives and of course Cooperative First, all of our sector, we are so thankful that you were able to, the day after hosting a conference in Colorado, make it up here to do the presentation for our annual MacPherson lecture. So if we could get a round of applause for Nathan, please.
Thank you.